Hello and welcome back to ConTinual, and it's another episode of the Panel Room. I'll be your host this evening, Jim Nettles. And so we're going to be talking about pulp, writing pulp, reading pulp, and the fun that is pulp. And so before we get started, I'm going to go around the room and let everybody introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Nicole. Ladies first.
So my name is Nicole Kurtz, and I am the owner of Mocha Memoirs Press, and we publish science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and a little bit of paranormal romance from underrepresented groups or marginalized people. Our mission, of course, is to amplify those voices in speculative fiction. I am also the author of 3 speculative mystery series, the Sybil Lewis series, which is cyberpunk, futuristic, pulpy. And I also do the Kingdom of Avis mysteries, which is fantasy mystery. And then I have another kind of futuristic noir series called Fawn and Briscoe.
Stuart.
Hi, everybody, I'm Stuart Jaffe. I'm the author of over 40 novels in 4 series, bunch of standalones. I'm best known for this, the Max Porter Paranormal Mysteries, as well as the Nathan Kay fantasy thrillers and the Parallel Society, where the 5th book is coming out soon. Actually, the 14th of this just came out a few weeks ago. So lots. Part of being a pulp writer is churning stuff out as fast as possible, and I work at that pretty hard. So we'll talk about that.
Mark.
Yes, I'm Mark Williams, and began as a teenager getting fascinated with late 19th century proto-pulp, I guess, the adult dime libraries and that sort of thing, and involved myself in a career for 50 years that was largely unrelated. And now that I'm largely done with that, I've created a little publishing company to put out curated collections of some of my favorites that I've read over these many years. So I have Dark Lantern Tales, and I have one series that's truly a series. I've got 2 collections. I rely heavily on one author, Albert Aiken, and the third series is sort of the shoot 'em ups that are a variety of nom de plumes, most of them artificial. So that's what I do. I'm the only one here who doesn't write any of them. I do edit a bit, and I do write some supporting literature around them, but that's it.
Bobby.
Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I write all kinds of stuff, but I've spent quite a bit of time in the pulp mines with new and writing existing characters. Like Domino Lady, for instance, who's up here. I've been lucky enough to write stories with her and Secret Agent X, the Avenger, the Spider, characters like that. In addition to creating our own pulp characters like Landstar Sky Ranger, which is very much in the vein of like the air pulps with planes and adventures and stuff like that. And then I also do modern stories that with kind of a pulp sensibility, like the Snow series, which is very much a modern day pulp-ish type story. So a lot of fun to be had playing in the pulp playground.
And Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Waters. I have been writing fiction and publishing since 2003. My first story was in Weird Tales, which has got a great tradition of pulp going back many, many, many decades. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that I have, I guess, technically written as much pulp as the folk here in on the panel with me, but
more than me.
Okay, fair enough. My latest, if I may plug one thing I've written actually about 60, maybe 65 short stories that have been published in various online and print magazines and anthologies. A few novels, most of them in small press, but I've got my first official, I guess, large publisher piece coming out very soon. It is 1636 Calabar's War that I wrote with Chuck Gannon, set in Eric Flint's 1632 Ring of Fire series, published by Baen. That's coming out in 2 weeks, actually, 2 weeks from today. So I'm quite excited about that, and that's who I am.
Kurt, congratulations on that one.
Yes, seriously.
Yeah, I'll come back and talk about that one on Hot Off the Press. So let's talk a little bit about, where you got connected to the idea of pulp. I mean, pulp is really tied back to the idea of the pulp paper that so many of these stories were originally printed on. I mean, that's kind of where we get the term from. But and I've read all the old Robert E. Howard, the John Carter of Mars series, as well as a lot of the short stories that were so much fun out of 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, name it. It probably pulled up and read some of them. So for y'all, where did you start? What was kind of your first influence in terms of what you're reading and picking up in pulp and genre? And what genre was it of pulp? So, Nicole, we'll start with you again.
So I fell in love with pulpy stuff watching Johnny Quest, right? And so I was already a big time reader. And so I just kind of sought out stories that were kind of adventure oriented like that. But I actually didn't fall into pulp per se until I knew I always enjoyed like Dick Tracy and Nero Wolfe and like very vintage old pulpy stuff. So I started as in my early 20s, started seeking that stuff out, right? Because I knew, hey, I like this. I want more of this. And so I just I didn't grow up with it. I didn't grow up reading it. But I definitely fell in love with those type of noir-ish stories, kind of pulpy stories. And then I went and sought out more writers as a young adult. And that's kind of how I fell into it, kind of backwards. It was kind of an extension of, I read a lot of horror. And so it was kind of an extension of horror in that way. You have these monsters sometimes, the Valley of Guanji, where there's a dinosaur in a Western town, right? So you kind of I fell into it that way. Here are these dark, kind of strange, weird tales, and they're kind of weird Western-y too, right? I love the weird Westerns. And so I kind of fell into it backwards that way. So but it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s before I even discovered that it was a genre that I would actually like.
What about you, Stuart?
I did not consciously become a fan of pulp. It was one of those things where I as an adult, as a writer, was actually at a convention, and the infamous John Hartness and I were on a panel together where we were describing how we write and the things we write, and we both kind of were like, we're pulp writers. Wow. I haven't realized it. And like Nicole mentioned Johnny Quest, or you think about other shows I loved as a kid, Land of the Lost, or, anything. I was a kid. I didn't sit there and go, oh, I like pulp. I just I liked everything. But I was gravitated to the more adventurous stories. And then, so, when I started writing, that's what I did. I wrote what I loved the most. And it really wasn't until well into my writing career that in trying to describe the kind of stuff I write, that I was realizing, I am describing, what pulp writers do. It's just a modern day version of pulp. And, especially like the Nathan Kay series that I wrote, I specifically that wrote that based on the old Mac Bolan and Remo Williams, what they used to call men's adventure, which was just a fancy saying pulp in the 70s and 80s. And I loved those books. And so I did my twist on taking those kind of characters and giving them temporary immortality and seeing where that went. So it just kind of, like I said, I just kind of always was doing it. There was no gateway drug for me. It just was the only drug for a long time.
What about you, Mark?
I was a series book collector when I was a young teen, and began to study and realize that there were copyright dates, there were different publishers, some of these were clearly republished or rewritten, and I began to rake through some amazingly seedy bookstores in downtown Chicago, where I'd get on public transportation, and I began to learn that some of these had originated actually as an earlier form of literature, as dime libraries and that sort of thing. And so I began to seek those out, and I discovered them. If nobody's been around them, this is a book, this is a novel, but it's kind of like a pamphlet, and that's what was the origins of a lot of the stories I deal with. They were sold in newsstands, they were sold in stationery stores and tobacco stores, the 1870s, 80s, 90s. And it was a form of literature that was ephemeral, it was commercial, and it was written without the least regard for what anybody, especially a teenager in the mid 60s, might understand about it or not. And I was hooked. So from that age, I began to gather material and collect it and hung on to things. And then, like say, a few years ago, I decided to put these things to work and read many, many hundreds of them, my own many hundreds of them, and began to sort out collections I felt could be enjoyed by a modern reader. And so I package them and set them up like that. Now they're rather than being an awkward sort of a fragile pamphlet, they're now a handy to read book. And I got it. That's what I do. But that's how I started out, though, as a collector, and maintained that issue over the years.
What about you, Bobby?
Well, this is going to sound very familiar, but I grew up watching adventure shows. I love, I really gravitated toward, even when it was adventure, something else, like even sci-fi adventure, like Star Trek or something like that, where they went to a planet and got into trouble, or the Lone Ranger, they went into a town, they got into trouble, or the Lost World, or any of that kind of stuff. And so I just love that discovery and getting into adventures and trying to figure out, just what was there. I had no idea what it was called, but my writing and my reading gravitated toward those type of stories as well. Actually, the first time I ever consciously had someone tell me I was writing pulp was when I was actually hired to write a pulp story for a publisher. He says, "We like your style. You're a very pulpy writer. We want you to write this pulp story." And I'm like, "Great. I have one question. What's a pulp story?" Which, so it was very much educational from that point on of what fell into the pulp genre. Because really, before that time, the only thing I knew about pulp was it was in orange juice, and there was a Quentin Tarantino movie by that name. I didn't really, I'd never really consciously thought of it in terms of, books. But over the years now, since I've been writing, I've worked with a lot of publishers that are, pulp oriented and doing either new stuff or playing with old pulp characters, which is a lot of fun. So I've gotten to go back and read a lot of older stuff I was not familiar with. Like, you mentioned Remo Williams earlier. I love the movie. Had no idea it was a book series until much later, And it was one of those things. It's like, and it's like discovering this amazing. Oh my God, there's books, and you can keep it going.
And in a true pulp tradition, there's like 200 of them each in that series.
Yeah. Because man, those guys were. I mean, I think I write fast. I think I write fast. Yeah,
bumping it out.
And I'm slow compared to the original pulp guys. They were, but yeah. So that was where it started with me was the action adventure, and I still love those type of stories. I love going out and discovering new things, or just having your character get into crap and have to get out of it.
What about you, Robert?
Well, I will basically kind of repeat initially what Stuart said. When you're young, and I was born in 1968. I didn't really start seriously getting into TV reading or anything until the mid to late 70s. You watch a lot of TV shows, you read stories, and you don't know you're reading pulp. You don't know you're watching pulp. You just do it because you enjoy it. You like watching it. I really loved the old westerns. The old westerns, the TV shows of the 60s and the 70s. Cheyenne, Have Gun Will Travel, Pat Masterson, Gunsmoke. Oh my lord! My love for it again was rekindled a few years ago when I visited my mother in Memphis because my dad would just put it on the Western Channel and just leave it on all day long. And just watch Pat Masterson all day and Have Gun Will Travel, which I love. The man in Have Gun Will Travel. He's just fantastic. I love that guy. So that was really my initial input, but I didn't really realize that it was pulp until in the 80s. And then in the 80s, I started reading, I guess pulp fiction. I guess what would be defined as pulp fiction, like you said, James, Robert Howard, Lovecraft. a Jewel, not Jewel, yeah, just some Jules Verne, but I don't know. I guess they're pulps. Also, Edgar Rice Burroughs,
Right.
his Barsoon series, and I just started to really love the adventure, the action adventure, and even to this day, I think that early influences really affect what I do. I can't stand having 2 or 3 pages go by in any story I write without some sort of action scene, some sort of quick pace action scene. It just I get almost physically ill without trying to put some kind of action or adventure kind of thing in there. And my I didn't really write pulp fiction, I guess, until I met a man, the late Rick Leider, who used to work with Bold Adventure Press, and he was the editor for Awesome Tales. He did 7, 8, 9 copies of it maybe before he passed away last year, unfortunately. And it was then that I began to sort of write. So I've written some pulp for him, and I probably other things that I've written would probably be classified as pulp too. I've never considered myself a pulp author though, but I'm sure that my writing tends to gravitate in that direction because of those early influences. I mean, I still love them today. I still love the westerns, and one of these days I am determined to write a western novel. I must. So there you go.
Well, and oh yeah,
I was going to say my parents were very big Western viewers too, if you can believe that. So I spent a lot of my childhood watching Gunsmoke and watching a ridiculous amount of Clint Eastwood Westerns, and just a lot of Westerns. And to this day, if I go to my dad's and go into his bedroom, it is on the Western channel. Like he never changes it to anything else. Unless it's football season in Tennessee, but
yeah.
Hey.
What I heard was back in the 50s and 60s when they were doing the things. Every studio in Hollywood at that time had 1 or 2 Western shows on TV. I mean, they were just Westerns were just absolutely dominated the television at that time. And it's my understanding that they would share scripts. And they would just modify them a little bit to, it would be the same plot, but they would have different people and maybe a different setting in this studio, and then they'd go around and do the exact same story in Cheyenne, and they do it in a slightly different place, slightly different thing. So that was how they basically got it on the cheap. So
yeah, that's also one of those things that's so true about writing even today, that plot is plot, but plot becomes story when you put your characters in. So putting Matt Dillon in that story and putting Paladin in the same plot gives you 2 very different stories because of how those characters would move
handle that situation. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's one of the fun things that when you look, and I was trying to remember because I went blank when I was looking it up. But my dad got me into Westerns as well. I mean, we went to all the things, we saw all the people, when the actors were doing the tours. And I mean, it's even in just the last couple of years that the last kind of the Western conventions just kind of wrapped up about 2 years ago, because that was the last of the actors from the old shows and whatnot. So looking at Westerns, I mean, that was a big influence for me because I read a lot of Dad's books. I watched a lot of the shows. I was also, I still am a huge sci-fi fan. So one of the things we kind of get into is how do you define pulp? What creates pulp? Because it's kind of like other than, I mean, to me, pulp is defined by it moves fast. Sometimes, especially if you get into a series, it's a little bit of rinse and repeat as to who the bad guy is. You just pile off the name and put in a different bad guy, and you also get to mash up genres much more. You can have, instead of riding horses, they're riding dinosaurs through town.
Right.
The next thing it is, you've got Firefly. I mean, that's kind of the
or
thing.
the Valley of Guanji.
Yeah.
So
I think in the modern day, the term pulp is less defined as a genre as it is defined now as a writing attitude, or because a pulp writer we can write in all different genres. I mean, which was true back then too. Obviously, it's already been mentioned. It originally came from the name from what they printed this stuff on.
Right.
Again, so it didn't matter what kind of story it was. It was how cheap it was produced. And then the pulp writers of that time, because they were being paid by the word, were pumping out words as fast as they could. And so it also had to do with the speed at which you were bringing them out. And what I think one of the reasons we see a resurgence of the pulp attitude amongst writers and somewhat thematically too, is that now, because of ebooks, you can pump books out very fast, and as fast as you can write them, and so that gave birth to that ability to do it. Whereas there was a period of time in between when the big, back then it would have been the big six, they had a vice lock on the publishing world, especially in genre publishing, that you basically were stuck. If you got a deal with one of them, you could put out one book a year. If you were if you wanted to do two, you had to use a pseudonym. And I'm putting out 4 or 5 books a year, and a lot of people think I'm fast, and I'm nothing compared to, the real guys out there, the pulpish heroes who are putting out, 1 million words a year. It's ridiculous. They're putting out a book every month, sometimes more than 1 book a month. So.
Well, the early stuff I'm dealing with, and again, this is probably more the roots of the pulp you're talking about, was almost performance art, in that many of these guys prided themselves. They were writing in pen and ink. They prided themselves on never going back. So they'd kind of get a story concept, and then plow on in and do several thousand words a day, and a couple of weeks turn in a novel, a 65,000 word novel, which is a normal size. So I think they set a stage for a sort of a work attitude on it, and they were paid typically on publication, usually negotiated flat fees, but they had to keep the product moving, because until it was published, they didn't see anything on it, and they saw no royalties whatsoever. So.
Yeah, and it was also pulp was considered throwaway art. It was throwaway entertainment.
This was at the time. These were again sold on the street. They were working people's entertainment, the TV of the 1880s, basically. Yeah,
it was, you read it, you throw it away, or when you get up to the war era, you recycled it. Mm-hmm. So there was not a lot of thought of people keeping, I imagine a lot of the old pulp writers would be very surprised if they could have seen today where people are collecting these things, and these things are going for big money, and they're,
I think the stuff I'm interested in was not written for the ages. It was sensational literature written for the week it was published, and I think that's some of the excitement I find in it. I mean, I'm in there for escapism, like a lot of people are, and in this way, by reading almost a conversation between a writer and a reader of 140 years ago, is more escapism to me yet. So anyway, that's my.
Well, I was wondering, if I may, I was wondering if also pulps were sort of defined by sort of a very clear-cut, I think as James sort of alluded to, a clear-cut separation between good and evil. It seemed to me that pulps were, the good guys, it was always clear who the good guys were. Yep. It's always clear who the bad guys were. They were almost sort of comically poor in the choices that they made. Good guys always won. This was not uncommon at all. And even to this day, there's a lot of TV out there and a lot of books out there where it's very obvious from the beginning who's the good guys and the bad guys. And there's a certain comfort to that, isn't there? I mean, in a lot of people's ways, as you say, it was escapism. You don't want to go into these very deep moral quandaries, so pulp sort of gives you that freedom to sort of define your own moral compass by who you root for and who you root against in the stories.
There are no, gray protagonists, right? Well, no gray protagonists.
And I'm sure there's pulps out there that have gray. I mean, I would have to think that Raymond Chandler probably
yes
gray. So I'm saying that there are instances of that, but it seems to me that the pure pulp, that as far as definition, had that really clear difference between good versus evil.
So I would like to talk about or argue that not all pulps are fast, right? Because some pulp noir is very slow burn, right? And so it's not always clear who the bad guy is or who, right? Because your protagonist is usually flawed in some moral department, or they have their own moral compass that they follow. And so I think that the action adventure pulp, it's a lot more clear who the others are and who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. But in terms of like mystery pulp or pulp noir, it's not always clear. And that's more what I write. I'm more leaning towards that, right?
I can attest to that even more in the modern days. I mean, we all know who, or most of us should, Glenn Cook. He's a very popular fantasy author, military science fiction, military fantasy science fiction. But he did write a sort of a pulp noir fantasy series called the Garrett P.I. series. And you're right, Nicole. They don't burn the page. The action in it doesn't burn the page.
It's very slow.
It's typical Nero Wolfe style kind of thing, where they just sort of work through page after page after page. He goes and talks to this guy. He goes and talks to this guy. He goes back to his office, and it is slow. It can be slow. There are action pieces in it, but you're right. There can be a slowness to sort of like a crime noir.
But it's a different kind of slowness than like in a literary novel. There's still a tension. There's still that's part of, I think, what makes like a noir pulp novel work so well is he's just sitting. If you look at it without the PI's narration and internal monologue, he's just sitting in his chair drinking a whiskey and smoking a cigarette while the dame walks in the door. But the way she walks in and the way he sees her and the way he thinks about her and the way he, goes over the problems in his head and realizes that if he doesn't solve this in the next 24 hours, he's going to be dead. And, all that. It's that same thing of you see in the movies where, horror movies are great at this, where if you take out the music and the, all the, you just look at what's take out all the sound. It's just somebody walking down a hallway. It's not.
It's the atmosphere that's created, right? Yeah. It's the atmosphere.
You put on the story, the expectation, suddenly it's terrifying.
Right. So I don't mean that like pulp noir is somehow boring. Don't.
No.
No one's saying that. But what I was saying, it doesn't incorporate that fast-paced action that you see in adventure pulp, right? Sure.
And it depends on what kind of pulp too. I mean, back in the day, there was train pulps. It was all stories about people riding trains. So they were more character driven. Or the romance pulps, which is probably I guess the modern day equivalent of that would be like a Harlequin. Not all of those, I would assume, were fast paced. I'm sure some were.
I'm only bringing the clarity to the conversation because for a long time we're just talking about pulp being action packed. I just want to make sure that for people who are viewing this, we actually delineate or distinguish that not all pulp was action oriented. That there are these other types of pulp, like train, airplanes,
especially back in the day. In the original days of it. Of course, there wasn't television. There wasn't an internet, this was so every genre was open, and it was, they wanted to please all kinds of sectors of the reading audience. Which, side note, I firmly believe another reason why were writers back then, especially writing by hand or hunting peck on an old typewriter, were able to write so fast is because they did not have the internet to distract them. Oh my goodness!
Well, you don't have to keep up with Facebook. I mean,
no one's doom scrolling for an hour.
if I didn't have social media or just video games, I would write so much more than I do now.
But this is what I was trying to get back to. Walter Gibson, The Shadow, was kind of my hero as a writer for a long time because he was cranking out a novel a week. Now, granted, there was a lot there of I'm rinsing off the serial numbers from last week's story, but I mean, he cranked out a serious volume of work to go through and make it all work. But it was one of those things that was dark, and I mean, he played with it. I mean, we see elements that come in from the noir, but we also see a bit of those elements of what became Batman. We see a lot of the what we would consider pulp of the day shaping what we see now in comics. It shaped a lot of our entertainment now, and it shaped a lot of our way we view story and the way we view character and the way we want to see things. I mean, if you look at all the TV we had during 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of it was written just like pulp. Or you look at radio shows, look at, Twilight Zone. So for you guys that are now writing the pulp and coming forward, or even Mark looking at and editing and looking at the difference between what we have then and now, how do you think that pulp is really influencing what we've got to work with and play with today? And so, Mark, I'll actually start with you.
Well, I'm just going to interject that again. I'm talking about a much earlier era than what you guys are. I mean, pulp per se, as a range of genres, it mostly dates from the 20s because it was the U.S. mail laws changed that. The people in the 19th century got away with cheap mail because it was legal to send a single story in one of these paper books. But the laws changed going into the early 1910s or thereabouts to where there had to be multiple things in there. And as the dime libraries began to fade, pulps began to enter the picture, which had multiple stories within them. The progenitors of that back in the era that I work from were the two forms were the dime library, which is sometimes called a dime novel, but the dime library was a collection of often unrelated stories that came out weekly as somebody's story in it. And then there were the story papers, which were a 8-page newspaper or tabloid-sized thing that had a number of serials in it. It had something romantic for mom and some kid stuff, some sappy poetry, and something more rough and tough for dad and the older boys. But so those are often very different from the dime libraries. The dime libraries were generally action-packed. They were aimed at the working stiff who wanted to have it rolled up in his back pocket and pull out and get some action briefly on a short break. The story paper stuff, which actually composes most of what I put out, is actually more thoughtful and more paced. Now, all of this sort of led up to the like I say, what are more properly called pulps, which the pre-comic stuff started in the 20s. And so I'm trying to delineate really what you guys are talking about. Do you see that same division, or in terms of pulps versus previous and later forms?
And especially how it's influencing you guys' work. I mean, that's one of those things that
right. So when you guys say pulp, I'm thinking 20s to 50s, the action magazines, that type of thing.
I mean, yeah. I think you get enough writers in the room, you'll get a bunch of different answers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of us, at least I do, for me, pulp is all of it. I mean, there's different, you can break up different eras of pulp, and there's even the Penny Dreadfuls, which are real early.
Well, that's the British name for the stuff I do, actually.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking about Penny Dreadfuls as well, but yes.
So, but it's all, to me, it's all one. If I want to be academic about it, I can break it down.
No, that's fine. It just, with the collector market, you got, silver, gold, brass, lead, whatever the hell they are.
Right. And there's different, I recognize there are different eras, but as a writer, I don't care. It's all just the stuff I like.
No, that's fine. And this is why this is really interesting to me to hear you guys, where you see your own roots in the thing. Good.
So, I mean, if we talk about Max Porter, so Stuart, I'll pick on you a little bit. So if we look at Max Porter and how we started there, for that character, I mean, obviously you had some thought about pulp when you created the characters, when you were bringing that together. How did it influence you?
So, well, I mean, yeah, it was there's the basic gist of the series is it's about a guy who moves to North Carolina and discovers his office is haunted by the ghost of a 1940s detective, and they start a detective agency together. So Max Porter is just the normal, everyday guy, and then the ghost is Marshall Drummond. And Marshall Drummond is absolutely a Sam Spade. I mean, he's pulled right out of, Humphrey Bogart tradition of that kind of thing. So it's not a very convoluted line. It's a very direct line from that, and then plunking that character into today, and having to deal with just regular problems that the human people are dealing with, and then in the series, every book deals with history of this real history of North Carolina, and I mix it with witches and ghosts and curses and all magic and all that. So that real history often can bring about some rather pulpy kind of storylines as well.
So, Bobby, for you, because you've played with both existing characters from the day, like Domino, versus the ones you've created yourself. So, obviously there's been a lot of influence on you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, it's one of those weird things. It's like, I know I like to write these type of stories. I never, like, again, when I started, it was never like, ooh, I'm going to write a pulp story. It was just, this is the story I wrote, and someone else goes, hey, that's a pulp story. And I'm like, okay. But, really, and pulp is one of those weird terms too, because, it still exists there was a long period of time where no one mentioned it, but it still existed. They just called it something else. I think, Stuart, you mentioned, like, in the 70s, it became men's adventure fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Or Harlequin's romance, certainly was a continuation.
Films.
Yeah, it was all a continuation. They just changed the names, because I don't know if just the word pulp had a connotation that it was that cheap throwaway entertainment or what, but it just, the style of stories didn't go away. Just how they were presented changed. And so writing my own stuff just tends to be, even when I'm doing stuff that's not technically a pulp story, like the In the Wind there, which is it's a cop story, it's a mystery. There's still a pulp flavor to it because that's just how I write, so that's in there.
Hey.
But when I do but when I do things like Domino Lady or Lance Sky Ranger or the Ruby Files, which were created either way back then or are new things set in that era, I'm a little more conscious of it, just because the Ruby Files is a PI, it's a pulp PI in the 30s. Crap, that thought is in my head. But I also think too, some of the publishers who are doing stuff with the older characters, they've become period pieces for a lot of them. And I don't always think that is necessary. I absolutely think some of these characters could exist now. They weren't created to be period pieces. They reflected the world outside the writer's window through an action adventure or whatever genre they were writing lens. So I think, like, Domino Lady I think she's not just a 1930s character. I think she could work just as well in a modern day with a few minor tweaks. I actually wrote a Secret Agent X novel for a publisher that hasn't come out yet, where I actually set him in the 21st century. And I didn't change a word of his origin story. His origin story is exactly the same. He just has more technology, because the origin that the original creators came up for him still works.
Wow.
Just the name of the war he was in changed.
I can completely believe that. I mean, it's very similar to superheroes. They've retold Spider-Man a zillion times, and in the most recent, the Tom Holland version takes place now, and he's a kid again. Who's going through it's the same Peter Parker from back when, instead of they may have changed it from gamma radiation to something that we know we might believe in now.
Nanotech or something. I think it's nanotech now.
Same story.
But could you imagine if we only told Superman stories that happened in 1938?
Yeah,
if that's all we did, because that was when Superman was created.
No, I know. But
imagine if we just we can only tell Superman stories in the 1930s.
Well, that's because buildings were shorter then.
That's how he did it.
So let me throw this. Oh, go ahead. No,
I wanted a chance to answer that question, because I also have pulp. Like, I have written a 1940s like noir pulpy story for Moonstone Books, and much of the kind of science fiction mysteries that I write have roots in pulp too. They're just pulpy. That's how I write. And so if you think about my Sybil Lewis series, both Sybil and Jane are actually Hawke and Spencer, who are actually Sherlock and Watson, right? So you're still looking at, these two, or Nero and Archie. And so you still have, but one of the things about pulp for me is that I subvert it because my PIs are women, right? So there is no femme fatale, right? There's like some guy who's like not is not kosher on the up and up. But I have inverted all those tropes for pulp because my PIs are women. And so I take a lot of the things that you would see in traditional pulp and I just kind of like, mess with them because and they're black, which you did not see in 1940s pulp. A lot of that. So I kind of subvert a lot of those stereotypes for pulp, but there's the feel of them are still the same. The pattern or the beats of the pulp story or the mystery is still the same. And so I just subvert the characterizations and the stereotypes. Robert?
Well, I have a question about that real quick, if I may, and I'll direct it to you, Nicole. Do the standard pulp tropes apply anymore? I mean, in many ways. I mean, because of the way that our culture is now, there's a lot more diversity, inclusiveness.
Yep.
I mean, can you get away? I guess you can if you sort of poke fun at it. You get away with the vamp, get away with the waif, the little girl who has to be protected. But I mean, there just seems to be certain cultural cultural tropes now, or cultural elements now that if somebody earnestly tries to go out and write a pulp thing in a serious manner, I mean, it might get shot down because it just does not fit modern sensibilities.
So my story for Moonstone is called Summer of Dread. And even though the protagonist is a woman, she's an oracle. And so she's very mysterious. You don't see a lot of her going out and physically doing anything because it's like the 40s in Chicago. She's a socialite. And so she has her Archie is the guy who goes out and does the footwork, who goes out and does like the intimidation, who goes out and follows and does surveillance and does all the grunt work where the oracle provides, right, these very ambiguous lines. And so the way that they work is very much like Archie and Nero. She's very much a delicate flower. She doesn't get her hands dirty. She's very much in that because that's the period. It's the 1940s. And so for that story, yeah, there definitely is. She's not in the Me Too movement. Okay. But there are things that I changed. Like she has a maid, and the maid, of course, is Black because it's the 40s. But the maid is very smart. And that through dialogue, I reveal that. Even though she's in this role, she's not ignorant. And so I have subtle ways of subverting those stereotypes, even though it's the 1940s. Right, but it's not overt, and it's not because that's not what the story is about, right? It's in this timepiece, as Bobby was saying earlier, it's confined by that timepiece. But for my more futuristic stories, like Sybil Lewis, like Fawn and Briscoe, they have pulpy feels and atmosphere and beats, like I said. But I don't think you can. I mean, there's probably some men. I hate to say that. There's probably some stories where they are very very confined to traditional roles for pulp that are written in a contemporary setting.
I don't think they're tropes. Well, first of all, pulp just again covers such a wide range of genre.
Right. I'm only talking about noir.
There's really not a lot of specific tropes that are problematic as much as there are archetypes. The femme fatale is a classic archetype that we see a lot of in pulp type of writing. But the thing about archetypes is that they apply way beyond any particular generation. And so I think that's another reason that we're able to still write this stuff now, is because we can take the framework of what was being written back then, and as Nicole has done, recast it all to appeal to a modern sensibility. And I think it was done, Sybil Lewis, I don't know if you would actually I don't know if you would like me calling it cyberpunk. It's cyberpunk.
It is cyberpunkish. It is that. It is. There are elements of it that are very high tech, low life. Yeah.
Yeah, and what? But because you were talking about it, I was thinking about it, and I was like, cyberpunk itself was a very pulpy thing, very pulpy thing that was created in the 80s. Even though the original Neuromancer was an attempt to be more than pulpy and be a bit highbrow about it, it still was what it was.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to throw this out there, and Stuart, I know you got to go here in a minute, so I'll let you take a shot at it here first, and then you can also tell everybody where to find you, and then we'll finish up with everybody else after we kick you out the door.
Okay.
So, do we think that part of the reason that it holds universal appeal and always has been, even though it's kind of has been seen at times in history as throwaway or whatnot, is it because what we see here is the simplicity in the characters? It is. The story itself is something that is relatable more than, say, more literary fiction. So is that part of the appeal, do you think?
I think that's always been an appeal, not just literary. So I have a master's in English. I've read a lot of literary fiction, and literary fiction can be a lot of navel gazing and a lot of intellectual people making themselves feel intellectual. And there's a lot of wonderful literary fiction out there, but it tends to make itself feel very self-important. Whereas I think pretty much all other writing, which could in some ways be called pulp, if that's the distinction we're making, pulp writing is just. My attitude when I write a book is at the very primary level of the book, the story has got to engage you and interest you and be fun. I want to entertain you.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I don't put in metaphor. It doesn't mean I don't use symbolism. It doesn't mean that there isn't the classic iceberg where there's a tremendous amount underneath. I have conflicted characters. I have depth of character. It's all there. And if my, classmates from years ago wanted to sit there and use and take literary theories and rip my stuff into pieces to look at how it all works and what it's actually saying about society, all of that is there. I write like that, but I still like to blow stuff up and oh fuck, I was gonna swear. See, I got it.
There you go. Oh, yay.
Thank you. But
I was worried.
But I still have a car chase. I still have excitement. And it's always been that way. Bram Stoker's Dracula, is a great story. That's great because it's filled with action and horror and all those things. So I don't know. In fact, I think a lot of the best literature that's considered literature, the stuff that not the stuff that's popular right now, but the stuff that really stands the test of time. A lot of time,
Frankenstein.
Yeah, Frankenstein, but even less genre stuff. You look at like Ernest Hemingway or John Steinbeck. Those stories, they're not people trying to be artsy. I mean, they are trying to be artistic, and they're trying to make their point. But their best stories actually are quite filled with a lot of tension, a lot of it may not be. Sometimes there's a lot of like wartime action, that kind of stuff, but sometimes it's very more noirish, where it's two people sitting there quietly talking to each other, almost like a Quentin Tarantino film where they're just sitting there talking, and it's all about what they're not saying that's creating all this god awful tension that's going to explode into something. I think that covers what you were trying to say. Ask me.
Did I have a point with that question?
I was trying to get my last word in before I said goodbye.
Well, Stuart, thanks for coming and joining us. And, I know you got to go jump onto another panel because, it's a convention. But where can everybody find you?
So thank you, everybody. You can find me at stuartjaffe.com or just plug my name into Amazon and you will find everything, every version of everything of mine that you could possibly find. So thank you all.
We'll see you again, Stuart. See you soon.
Hi, Stuart.
Hey, Stuart.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Robert, now I'm going to throw it over to you.
Well, we
So-
ending now, right? So it's a final goodbye.
No, now we're going to continue the
No,
fun
he just
part
had
of the
to leave early.
conversation. We got rid of Stuart now. We can talk.
Okay.
Now.
So what was the question?
So I'm actually going to change up the question just a little bit because I mean, I think we kind of beat it to death a little bit. Of when we look at it, why is it so popular? What's, for those that love what we classify as pulp, in all the different genres and everything else. But so if we look at those things that we love, I mean, a lot of it boils down to the hero and the protagonist and the antagonist. So for you, what makes for the good antagonist? Forget the
Well,
hero; they're boring.
For the antagonist,
Sure.
I think for Pulp to succeed, I think the antagonist needs to have. I mean, he may be misguided, she may be misguided, but I think they do have to have courage of their convictions. They have to really believe that what they're doing is right. The hero always believes that he is the hero in his own. I mean, the antagonist always believes that he is the hero in his own story, right? So I think if that comes across well in a story, that that they have it, and you write a story such that it is possible in the reader's mind that the bad guy could actually win. He may not win in the end, and he often doesn't in Pulp, but that it is tangible that he could win and that he believes in what he's doing. I think that makes the character a better character, regardless of the morals that he or she may obtain. And I think it will create a more lasting impression on the person who's reading the story.
What about you, Nicole? Because you, much like we were talking earlier, you do some very gray, both antagonists and protagonists. So, it's always nice to see because they're conflicted. They're always developed. So for you, what is it that really, what do you want to see in your antagonist and protagonist that builds out within the genre that really is part of what carries the story and part of what we love about reading these stories?
For my antagonists, they're very much like Killmonger and Black Panther. They really believe that whatever, and it's pretty much what Robert said, they believe that what they are doing, they have the courage of their convictions. What I am doing is better for myself, my family, my community, right? My business. I'm doing this for a good reason, right? And they may even think that the action steps that they're taking are not bad action steps at all. And so if you think about your average serial killer, most of them or some of them believe that by murdering prostitutes, they are doing a service for the city or for the town. They believe that. And they think, well, why am I the bad? It's like, why am I the bad guy? And so if you think about Michael Douglas' character in Falling Down, by the time he gets to the end of the movie, he's like, I'm the bad guy? Like, he was really surprised that he has this trail of mayhem after him, like in his wake. But he's really shocked when he's shot by, right at the end, that I'm the bad guy? Me? And so when I work on my antagonist is a fully rounded character. Not always a foil for the protagonist, but they're definitely someone who believes wholeheartedly that what they're doing is right. Even if it's, I'm going to rob all these people or all these banks or this corporation or what have you, because they're evil, because they take advantage of poor people, because I am going to give it back to a charity. I'm going to split half of it with my mother who's got cancer. They have all these other, they believe wholeheartedly that whatever actions they're taking from their viewpoint are correct. And my protagonist, especially Sybil, Sybil's not like Fawn. So in my Sybil Lewis series, Sybil is in, DC. It's the future. It's a mess. It's a Blade Runner-esque society. She feels like she has to do certain things just to survive and be safe. And so she's morally gray because you'll see her. She's very much a shoot first, ask questions later because of the environment that she's in. If you were to take Sybil and put her in a different environment, she may not have that. She may change her personality or change her habits to stay safe because those are no longer needed. And so the environment for a lot of my stories also influence how my characters behave. Because in real life, your environment where you're raised, whether it's inner city Detroit or the west side of Chicago, or whether it's out in Beverly Hills, your zip code sometimes determines who and how you become and how you interact with people. And so for my protagonist and for my antagonist, where are they coming from? Right? You see that in Black Panther as well. T'Challa and Killmonger are both royal princes of Wakanda, but based on where they're raised, it completely changes how they see the world and how they interact with that world and that environment. And so those are the kind of the driving forces for my pulpy protagonists and antagonists.
So, Mark, I'm going to change the question for you a little bit. I mean, obviously,
Sorry,
we're talking.
did I beat a horse?
No, actually,
Ooh, you beat that horse good.
no, building on that, because, you know, if we look at the stories that he's bringing through Dark Lantern Tales that are 150 years old, 140 years old, we still see a lot of those same kinds of elements.
Well, yeah. I mean, the detective story in a modern sense dates to the arguably 1840s with Poe, but maybe even before. But the elements in the stories that I'm putting out are carry further. A friend of mine wrote a blurb on one of these books, which he said, the crooked police chief, the beautiful woman who may or may not be on the level, the cheerful thugs with their inventive patois, the resourceful hero, all characters that fans of Hammett would encounter 40 years on. And Hammett, of course, it's Sam Spade and all the rest of these that turned into movies in the 1930s and 40s that they're influencing some of the works you guys are doing. So I think this stuff reaches back. And I'm just trying to find, I think there's a wealth of these stories that are not being made available to people. And that's what I'm trying to go for on them. But as far as the story elements and the story qualities, the things that they don't fit into modern descriptions of genres. They don't. My wife, Ann Wicker, some of you know her, edits, and she watches TV shows, and she'll say, "Oh, it's the this that plot," you know, because she identifies all those plots. And but with these books, she can't do that because they don't really use those same elements. Those hadn't been thought up yet, and so I just think they're fun stories to read, and I try and pick out ones that are going to reach somebody who's an adventurous historical fiction reader and likes what became pulp.
And I love the phrase there, cheerful thugs.
Oh, yeah. And they are. This particular author is really good on dialect. But there's a lot of, again, they were writing for people of the time, so there's a great deal of curious spellings. Compound words like tomorrow are typically 2 words or perhaps hyphenated. Clue tends to be CLEW. And a lot of the slang didn't carry through the ages. So I have a glossary in the back of each book, and all of you are welcome to go to my website if you're curious about any of this stuff. It's a cheap WordPress website, so it has a really long address. I would say in parentheses or quotes, put in Dark Lantern Tales on your search, and you'll find it, including a master glossary.
Thank you.
I think that what this shows too is like people are still people, even 100 and some odd years later.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a lot of people that are this, there are people looking to take stuff that's not theirs. That is not anything that's changed in the last 1,000 years.
Well, and these books, I'm sorry to interrupt you. These are also adult books, there are characters who are androgynous, to say the least, on some of the bad guys. There's clearly a couple of lesbian characters. There's a transsexual woman detective, and this is all from the 1880s. So pretty much everything going on now was going on then, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's quite all right. But yeah, so people are people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's none of that's changed. I mean, there's still people trying to take stuff that doesn't belong to them. There's people trying to stop them. There's people that see someone in trouble and tries to help them. That's how archetypes are built. I mean, and that's why they endure, because there are still people like that today. There are still crooks. There are still good people. There are still heroes. There are still villains. And so with everything that I do, I always start with character first. I want to get to know the character. I can then drop my character into the plot. Because if you look at the pulp books that pre-exist, like when I write characters that I don't own, the fan base for those existing characters, it's always the same thing. It's never don't tell a bad story. It's don't screw up this character. I love.
Yeah.
That's very important.
The fans, so the fans have fallen in love with Doc Savage, for example.
Right.
You know, fans of Doc Savage are fans of Doc Savage. They may not love every Doc Savage book because,
Right.
oh, I didn't like, but that's kind of the same way we watch TV. You know, if you fall in love with a character on TV and they have a crappy episode, you don't go, I'm never watching this again. You just go, oh, it's a crappy episode, but I love these characters. I'll be back next week.
Right.
I think a lot of it's that way. They fall in love with these characters, and if you can get them invested in the characters, they'll follow you, and hopefully you won't have too many crappy episodes for them to have to sit through.
So we've been going for a while now. So I want to throw this and have everybody go around and let us know where we can find you. But the last thing I want you to do as well is also give that one piece of writing advice for somebody that's looking at starting and thinking about doing a little bit of pulp writing. I mean, we've always got the easy one, which starts with go read a bunch of it, figure out what you like, what you don't. But, what's the one thing for somebody that's really getting started that you've got advice for? So, all right, Robert, I'll let you go first.
All right. Well, you can find me on www.roberternestwaters, one word, roberternestwaters.com. That's my website. It's got everything up there that's current, mostly current. And like Stuart said before he left, if you go to Amazon and just search for my name, Robert E. Waters, you'll be able to see all the books, most anyway, of all the books. I have stories and our novels. So that's where people can find me. As far as advice goes, in terms of writing pulp, I guess we could say, I would say, look at the dialogue. Look at the dialogue that's used to write characters and how they respond to each other. What is the language that they use? How do they do it? It seems to me that a lot of pulp, a lot of action adventure, it's really sort of tight, snappy dialogue, and that is a lot of ways of how people just continually talk all the time. They don't get into long diatribes in most cases. I mean, if you want to set up a real life, everyday back and forth between characters, no matter who your characters are, read Pulp, read Louis L'Amour. We didn't mention him, but I'm telling you, the man is awesome. He's just fantastic. And he never lets 2 or 3 pages go, as I said earlier, without having some kind of significant thing happen in the fiction to change the course of the plot, which is significant because it keeps the writers on their toes. So those would be my 2 advices.
Nicole.
So you can find me at NicoleGivensKurtz.net. And on Twitter, my Twitter handle is Nicole G. Kurtz. That's also my Facebook / Nicole G. Kurtz as well as my author page. In terms of, you can find my books anywhere, Amazon. Just put my whole writing name in, Nicole Givens Kurtz, in quotes, and you'll find stuff. But in terms of because I fell into it backwards, and I don't do, I would say read it, but at the same time, I would argue that I would suggest that you take what you love about pulp, which we all talked about in this panel, character, action, and then when Stuart mentioned the quick turnaround, quick stories, fast stories, be entertained. I would say make sure that you are entertained as the author. That's the story that you tell, make sure that you are entertained by it and that it's satisfying for you, that you are laughing, that you are on the ride and you enjoy the ride that you're telling, because that will carry over to your reader. And so I wouldn't work too hard trying to emulate existing or former pulp writers. I would spend time writing the best pulp story that I could write that is entertaining for me, because that's what's going to carry over to your audience.
What about you, Mark?
Well, I hate to tag on to all these wonderful writers, but I just say make it accessible, make it exciting, and above all these earlier forms are not sacrosanct. Take something that you like and employ them any way you want, and invent your own new stuff. But yeah, as she said, pull the favorite elements out of favorite films or whatever. Just turn it into your story.
And where can we find you?
Oh, the easiest place is my website, Dark Lantern Tales. And if you search those 2 or those 3 words in quotes, you'll find it, Dark Lantern Tales. There's even a page that says, what is a Dark Lantern anyway? So if anybody's curious, the info is there.
And Bobby?
You can find me at bobbynash.com. I'm also on Facebook at author Bobby Nash. Twitter, I'm at Bobby Nash. And Instagram, I'm at Bobby Nash Writes. So I definitely agree, especially with what Nicole said with not forcing it. If pulp is not your thing, you're not going to enjoy probably writing it if it's not your thing. If you want to write pulp, and this is something Nicole and I have discussed at length elsewhere, it's a niche market. No, it's a niche market. Mm-hmm. It is not a huge market. The market that's out there is pretty excited about pulp and checks out a lot of the stuff, but it is a small market. You are not going to get rich writing short stories for pulp anthologies.
No.
Know this, know this, hear me, know this going in. But
as
you
Bobby
can
says
also,
from his mansion on top of the Georgia Mountain.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So, but I will say this, the pulp industry, the people involved in pulp, there are a lot of fantastic people that are writing, producing, printing, publishing, doing art for the new pulp books and reprints. There's a lot of people that are very passionate about pulp stuff. So if you're passionate about it, there's a lot of people you can meet and talk to that are just as passionate. Mm-hmm. So there is a wonderful little pulp community if you're looking for other people to discuss your love of this stuff with. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming and joining and hanging out with us. I've been your host, Jim Nettles, and you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, and of course here at ConTinual Convention. And if I've got one last little piece of advice, there is something to be said for the speed of writing and how fast you're writing and cranking it out, because a lot of the time the speed you're writing with also leads to the speed that your characters use in their dialogue and how fast everything moves along. So thanks, everybody. We will see you again next time.
Thanks for letting me hang out.
Thank you.
See you later. Thank you.
Bye,
see you, Nicole. Bye-bye, Mark. Bye-bye,
Bye, Robert.
James.
Bye, Bobby.
See you guys.
Great to see you guys.